Liveryman David Starkey, who will be no stranger to any of you on account of his distinguished career as a historian and a broadcaster. He has historically focused on the Tudor period, but he's also been an expert on the monarchy and on the Magna Carta, which I think sort of suggests that this may not be the last time we're inviting him along to give a talk. But for now, he's talking about the dawn of the Tudor period and the educational foundation of King's College and Eton. Thank you very much, David.
Fellow barbers, ladies and gentlemen, it is an enormous pleasure to be back in this hall where, in many ways, I began a career that broadened out from the university. I owe this company and individuals here, I'm delighted that John Boots, past master Boots, is here. I owe this company a profound debt. My first major exhibition was largely made possible by the cooperation of this company. It's back in 1991 when I first discovered, again through Andrew Harfield, then the clerk, I first discovered the extent. I am forgetting to turn on. I don't normally forget to turn on, but in any way, but there we are. That's better. That's right. As I was saying, Andrew Harfield, then clerk, it was then that I discovered the company's extraordinary Tudor treasures, of which, of course, the greatest is hanging there. The company, the reason I did it, of course, 1991 is the 500th anniversary of the birth of Henry VIII. And I did my first major exhibition at the National Maritime Museum on the, we called it a title I think I would probably repudiate nowadays, a European court in England. This was before we'd thought of Brexit. It was when the National Maritime Museum was still trying to sell it, it may indeed be so for all I know, was still trying to sell itself as a European museum. And of course, this was the Henry VIII, not of Brexit, but this was the Henry VIII of the treaties with France. It was the Henry VIII of the close association with the Habsburgs and everything else. But it's a wonderful exhibition, and you lent in a very important way to it. And indeed, my life, of course, happily sort of enabled me to do Henry's birth, then the accession for Henry's accession, the exhibition for Henry's accession in 09, in 2009, the exhibition for the 500th of his accession, and you actually lent that, and that was the star of the great exhibition that we did at the British Library. So a deep debt, and it's very nice to be able to pay a little of it here. Also, of course, it's a debt to the extraordinary educational achievement of the late Middle Ages. I am a product not of Eton. It's very obvious, isn't it? I'm not quite sure what Eton boys call people like me, but it's something not terribly polite. But my school was founded not very much later. Unlike Eton, it was abolished by the activities largely of public school boys as grammar schools were destroyed. But it was founded in 1525, again as part of that extraordinary educational endeavour of the late Middle Ages. But what I want to talk about isn't so much the educational aspects of Eton and King's. I want to talk about their building. I want to talk about what they tell us about Henry VI, King Henry VI, who founds them, and his successors who complete the extraordinarily extravagant schemes of the king. We're used to thinking of Henry correctly as one of the very, very worst of English kings. And there is a deep irony, isn't there, that one of the very, very worst of our kings founds two of the most important national institutions, Eton and King's. But why do I describe him as so bad? Well, as I'm sure you know, he contrives to lose the entire inheritance of Henry V. He is a man of total, absolute incompetence. Nowadays, we'd make all sorts of excuses for him and probably say he was autistic or something of the sort. But he destroys the greatest inheritance of any medieval monarch. But he founds these two extraordinary creations of Eton by Windsor and of the twin at Cambridge. What was he doing? Well, he was expressing, of course, and this is important that we realise this, is expressing fundamentally a religious motive. We tend to think of them as schools and as a university college. The thing that links them is a devotion to the Virgin Mary. And the thing that links them is something else. They are what are called colleges. Again, we've really lost the sense of what the word college means in the context of the late Middle Ages. We think of it as essentially either a university college or a special sort of school, or a college as a learned body, as something else, of course, it's an inheritance from the Tudor period, and that man's fascination with medicine, the College of Physicians and that sort of thing. But the term college in the late Middle Ages essentially means an ecclesiastical foundation devoted to the commemoration of its benefactor. And again, we need to understand this very clearly. It is the idea that if you found a college, the fellows and the boys, because usually it would be a foundation that would be, say, 10 or 12 priests, there'd be something called a master or a provost, there'd be 10 or 12 fellows, which were almost invariably priests, and then if it had an educational function, there might be 20, 30, 40 boys, there would be a choir, and so on. We focus on the boys and the schoolmaster. The foundations invariably focused on the fellows, the priests, and the provost, and their duty to pray for the soul of the benefactor, to keep up a permanent cycle of prayer. All of these buildings are part of the, and foundations, structures, are part of the extraordinary late medieval view that salvation is essentially a complex process. It's not the sort of Lutheran act of conversion. Instead, it is that, obviously, the medieval church is realistic. We are mixed, we are confused creatures. We're not absolutely and simply good and bad. And in order to recognize that fact, the Middle Ages invented, because there is absolutely no biblical basis for it, it invented purgatory, the middle state between heaven and hell. And our extraordinary inheritance of medieval institutions, which we retain more completely, I think, than any other country because of the accidents of our bizarre non-Reformation, the extraordinary inheritance of medieval institutions, including livery companies, were essentially there to pray for the souls of their founders, to get them through purgatory. That was the essential function. So you left money as a kind of insurance policy on salvation. The endowment was designed to maintain a permanent cycle of prayer. And if you look at the foundation charter, it's one of the so-called Consolidated Charter of Eton, one of the most magnificent of 15th century documents, it shows the king praying to the Virgin in majesty, offering up his prayers and the prayers of England, because one of the things that Eton was supposed to do was not simply to offer up prayers for Henry, but to offer up prayers for his entire realm. And you see behind the king, the Lords and the Commons. The Lords still very much looking as they do now, in their fancy colours of red and white. And the House of Commons, of course, very firmly below them. Ratifying the king's desire for this permanent cycle of prayer. So let's just understand what they are. They're religious foundations with, as it were, education attached. So this will explain a lot of what I'm going to tell you. The second thing that we need to think about is what they attest of the absurd vanity of Henry VII. Henry VI. Both of them are conceived of on a gigantic scale. Gigantic scale. The scale of kings, about which I'll talk in a moment, is roughly what Henry intended, though no thanks to him and his incompetence. But Eton, we must remember, is the merest fragment of what he intended to construct. The chapel, as it is now, is about a quarter of what he wanted. He envisaged a grand church longer than Lincoln and wider than Winchester. And having built one rather handsome one, because it's not big enough, he then pulls it down and starts again, and unfortunately falls and finds himself fleeing from his own kingdom in 1460 before it's actually finished. Kings is an even more extraordinary story, and it is, as I said, on kings that I primarily want to focus. Oh, by the way, the relationship between the two of them, as I'm sure most of us know, Eton is intended as the feeder school. It's the feeder school to the college at Cambridge. It's the relationship between the two of them is originally established in the previous century by William of Wykeham's twin foundations of Winchester on the one hand and New College at Oxford on the other. And the statutes of Eton, the statutes of kings, are very, very closely modelled on those of Winchester and of New College. And by the way, there's another thing that one just needs quickly to slip in there. The bishopric of Winchester will constantly come up in what I'm talking about. That is, of course, because it is the richest bishopric in the country. It is one of the richest sees in all of Europe. The English, if you actually look at England, it's got about a quarter of the number of bishops of Sicily. The bishops cluster thickly in Italy, and most of them, apart from the Pope and the Patriarch of Venice and whatever, are really rather poor. The English bishops are few. There are only 26 of them, and they are, generally speaking, unless you get a runt see like Rochester or the worst fate for any clergyman is to be given a Welsh see. The infinite humiliation of Llandaff or St David's, but you have to crawl your way up from there. But Winchester is vastly rich, and if you actually look at the colleges of Oxford, about half of them are founded out of the wealth of the See of Winchester, the last of them being, of course, Christ Church, which Bishop Wolsey is also Bishop of Winchester, along with so many other things, and so much of the wealth of the See goes there. So, and again, bishoprics, remember, are endowed with vast amounts of land. We tend to see it as the kind of, the products of the faithful counting pennies into boxes. Please, please, please. These vastly rich landowners, and the size of the cathedrals is a direct function of the wealth of the bishopric. So some of the money goes to Oxford. So Henry then founds on the model of New College and of New College and of Winchester. He founds his twin foundation. I mentioned the ludicrous scale of Eton, which means that it's not finished at the time of his death. The scale of kings is even more extraordinary, and it completely transforms Cambridge. Why does Cambridge look so different from Oxford? The reason is Henry VI. He knocked Cambridge down. The extraordinary size of the court of King's College, Cambridge, is the centre of medieval Cambridge. Those of you who are at all familiar with Cambridge, you will know there is the street where Queen's is, and then at the other side, Trinity Lane. So we have Queen's Lane and Trinity Lane. That is the original high street of Cambridge. And he simply sweeps the centre away and puts this gigantic, or intends to put this gigantic structure there. In other words, Henry is not only important in terms of the foundation of Eton and of King's, he is the person who transforms the relationship and power balance of the two universities. It's very important that we understand. We tend to think of Oxford and Cambridge as level pegging. I am a Cambridge man. They do not. When I found myself with Stephen Hawking in San Francisco and New York launching the 800 campaign of Cambridge, I caused a frisson of horror in which I said the first 400 years might as well not have happened. Not a single thought that matters, not a single original idea emerges from the first 100 years of Cambridge. 400 years of Cambridge. It's a mere school to produce East Anglian archdeacons. If you want a sense of the total inferiority, I speak as a Cambridge man, the total inferiority of Cambridge to Oxford. Look at old schools Oxford, magnificent structure with its wonderful fan-vaulted roof, and which leads into Bodley and all the rest of it. And then look at its equivalent at Cambridge in the old schools, which is now the University Administrator's Common Room, which is an East Anglian barn. It is absolutely nothing else. But it is the extraordinary shift of royal interest to Cambridge which then transforms it. So Oxford is medieval and ecclesiastical. Cambridge is 15th, 16th century and royal. And it is Henry VI, bizarrely, that is the axis. Again, but why does he found the college in Cambridge if it's this rubbish unit? It's roughly of the standing of Hull. Or East Anglia or something. Why does he patronise Cambridge and not Oxford? The reason is simple. Oxford had betrayed the faith. Oxford is the home of heresy. It's the home of Wycliffe at the end of the 15th century, at the end of the 14th century, and because of that, you get the constitutions of Oxford. We've been just apologising for them, of course, because of the relations with the Jews and all the rest of it a few centuries earlier. But the constitutions of with Archbishop Arundel, the constitutions issued in Oxford by Arundel at the beginning of the 15th century frees English academic life for a century and institutionalised an inquisition in England and the beginnings of persecution and all the rest of it. So Oxford had been too good. Remember, original thought in the Middle Ages doesn't get you stars in the research assessment exercise. It gets you burned alive. And Oxford had been too good with original thought, so Cambridge is safely dull. That's the reason you get, Cambridge is safely orthodox. That's why the money goes there. So again, as I said, there's an immensely ambitious scheme. You knock down the middle of the end. I mean, can you imagine it? He spends his fortune, you buy it the entire, this is why there's no sense of a medieval centre in Cambridge. Why Market Square is this odd thing that sits outside the university. But when you think of the High in Oxford, originally the main street of Cambridge, which ran through the site of King's College, would have been exactly like that. But of course, the other thing that it does was Henry VI had created this vast space. Everybody else wants two. And of course, when he comes to found a college, when he comes to found Trinity, it's got to be even bigger. So you've had one enormous college, which is King's. Then Lady Margaret Beaufort, and we'll talk a little bit about her, founds another vast college at St. John's. And then Henry VIII has got to found the vastest of the lot with Trinity. So you create totally different pattern of a few very, very large colleges as opposed to the dense network of smaller colleges which characterises Oxford. Henry VI, the explanation of the difference. But of course, he left Eton at least a working institution. King's was barely even that. At the time of his death, this vast conceit of a chapel was barely foundations. There was no roof, only the west end, you sort of rose even to the height of the eaves. And what happens to both these foundations? Well, of course, they are then associated with a king, as I've said, who is an absolute failure, and to a dynasty which is replaced by a rival. What happens very quickly with Eton, I promised I'd at least fill the story in, what happens with Eton, at first, Edward III, the king of the first king of the House of York, decides effectively to extinguish it, and he transfers its vast endowment again at Windsor to St. George's Chapel, Windsor. He's particularly interested in the Order of the Garter, and he's actually buried there. But the thing is that the Eton Foundation is rescued by its first provost, and somebody who'd been very much at the side of Henry VI when he'd founded it, by, in fact, the Bishop of Winchester at the time, William Waynflete. And it's he who helps the re-endowment and to make the buildings livable and usable, though on a very, very much smaller scale than had been envisaged by Henry VI. So we can part that story. Eton is now working, it's all right, it's going to be okay. King's is a very different story. It had received this vast endowment. It is stripped of its endowment by Edward, and it has the only bit that was really built, the courtyard, the quad, not a quad, that's Oxford. The court was simply a demolition site. A tiny bit of what is now the old schools was actually the functioning bit, the collegiate bit of King's. It's also very important we understand something else. All Cambridge was a building site at this point. The university had also made the terrible mistake of tearing down Great St Mary's because it wasn't big enough and had run out of money. So you've got to think of the entire centre of Cambridge at this point effectively as half-finished buildings, ruined buildings, squatters. It's a complete mess. Also plague-ridden. How is this to be rescued? Well, it sleeps under Edward IV. But famously, of course, Edward IV, although he'd had extraordinary luck, he'd survived dethronement, he'd come back, he'd managed to produce 2 sons and a great clutch of daughters. Nevertheless, the eldest son wasn't quite old enough to be king in his own right, and he's usurped by the terrible Richard III. Easily the worst king in English history. I hope there are members of the Richard III Society here. If so, perhaps they will explain to me how somebody having seized the throne with something like acclaim in 1483 contrives to lose it to the weakest claimant in English history only 2 years later. You know, you've really got a lot of explaining to do. But the crucial role of Richard III in our story is that he is the person who rescues the reputation of Henry VI. And here again, there's this fascinating story of kings and other royals who die violent deaths. We're familiar with the truth of this story, of course, from Diana, who was effectively sainted. She was made a secular saint, and anybody who visited South Kensington and Kensington Palace and saw the piles of votive offerings, the rotting flowers, the teddy bears, all sorts of things heaped up outside the gates of Kensington Palace. That's exactly what happened with the death the violent death of a prince or of a king in the late Middle Ages. They were, as it were, made saints by popular acclaim. Henry was being quite difficult to saint because great care had been taken to dump him in a relatively remote place, Chertsey Abbey. It is Richard III, as it were, determined to reconcile the dynasty, reconcile himself to the ghost of Henry VI, who buries him at Windsor and gives him a rather handsome, rather noble tomb next to that of his own brother, next to that of Edward IV. And at that point, the cult of Henry VI as a saint without being created a saint by the Pope begins. And Richard does something else. And by the way, you see exactly the same phenomenon with Henry V, whose father had murdered Richard II. Richard II is rehabilitated, reburied in the Abbey by Henry V. In other words, these royal quasi-saints who've been terribly bad in life but are reinvented in death are essentially used to their enemies. Your enemy, as it were, the rival house reconciles themselves and sort of buys you off. A bit like Piers Morgan getting enthusiastic about Diana. You get the general idea of that kind of world. But Richard III also shows his devotion. By the way, it's probably Richard III who had actually given the final blow to Henry VI in the Tower, which lends an extra frisson. I'm not suggesting Piers did anything similar, but that lends the final edge to the story. But Richard also begins on a very large scale the rebuilding of kings. He picks up, he re-endows it, he starts work very rapidly on rebuilding the chapel and all the rest of it. He goes even further. He turns, anybody here from Queen's? He turns Queen's into a rival college to King's, determined to have a Yorkist foundation, a Yorkist Royal Foundation to match the Lancastrian Foundation of Kings. But then unfortunately, and Cambridge leaps onto the bandwagon, declares him worthy of the Mass, Salus Populi, the saviour of the people once every year. The university dances attendance upon him. And then unfortunately, of course, he's defeated by Henry VII, at which point Cambridge becomes absolute persona non grata to the Tudors. It's a very extraordinary story. And Henry VII, although again, look at Henry VII. Henry VII had encountered Henry VI as a boy. His first great experience as a boy at the time of the reademption in 1470 is when he's brought from the family that had been the Harbert family that had been looking after him in Wales. He's reunited with his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort. They go and see Henry VI at the Palace of Westminster, and this is the moment at which two extraordinary things happen in Henry Earl of Richmond's life, the future Henry VII. The first is that scene which is reproduced in Shakespeare of Henry VI, sort of saying here, prophesying the future succession of Henry Earl of Richmond. Here is the boy to whom we must yield power and dominion. And that scene does actually happen. Quite what the words are spoken there, we don't know. And the other thing which I discovered, and again, it's the, as it were, prevalence of old Etonians in public lectures, when I was giving a version of this lecture at Harlaxton Hall and produced the next bit of information, I recited a prayer which appears in Henry VII's will as the prayer that he'd learned in childhood and had used ever since, whereupon 6 hands went up and said, "Don't you know that's the prayer of Eton College?" In other words, there is a very strong possibility that this prayer, which also appears at the beginning of John Blackman's life of Henry VI, which is later, it's a Tudor creation, that prayer is real, is Henry VI, and was learned by Henry VII when he's a young man in 1470. So this very, and of course, you know, he claims to be a Lancastrian, Henry VII claims to be a Lancastrian, and all the rest. Nevertheless, because Richard III had flung this vast amount of money and prestige at King's College, he severs connection with it, he strips it of his endowment, he goes to Cambridge only on the way to go anywhere else. He avoids Cambridge. It's an extraordinary story. So why then, at the very end of his reign, does he suddenly decide, I am going to complete the building of King's College Chapel on exactly the scale, whereas Eton is a cobbled job. Come on, all Etonians admit your chapel's a mess. It's a cobbled, isn't it? It's a cobbled job. It's not architectural. There are wonderful bits, but as an architectural entity, it's hopeless. Whereas the Chapel of Kings is glorious. It is one of the very greatest buildings of the world, and it is so because Henry VII decided to complete it absolutely as the founder intended, using the foundations, the structure. We've no idea whether it's intended to have vaulting like that. He varies only in a single very important respect. Henry's very precise about what he wants from buildings. Henry VI has specified that it shouldn't be decorated. Whereas, of course, Henry VII is determined that it will be plastered with Tudor badges and roses and crowns and all the rest of it, which the fellows of Kings, I remember in my day, with their typical shocking taste, insisted in putting electric light bulbs inside, if you remember, those of you who are familiar with the interior. So why does he do it? Who shifts his opinion? What is the explanation? And the explanation takes us to the heart of, remember I began by talking about these things as essentially religious. It takes us to the heart of the religion of the period. It takes us into the extraordinary, curious, complex, tormented character of King Henry VII himself. It takes us into notions of purgatory. It takes us into notions of sainthood. It takes us into notions of miracles. All of these things are involved. It's a complex story. I'll try and get through most of it. I at least hope that I sketch out the principal bits. What seems to have happened is an interweaving between Henry, his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, to whom, of course, he was profoundly attached. You know, again, just driving home the awful realities of dynastic life. She had given birth to him at the age of 13. This is because she was married at the earliest legal age. Remember, the Bible, like present Islam, specifies an age of marriage of 12. And she's married to Henry's father, to Edmund, Earl of Richmond at that point, so that he can get his hands on her estates. And the marriage, of course, is again part of the cementation of the Lancastrian dynasty, because Henry, Earl of Richmond, is the uterine half-brother of the uterine half-brother of Henry VI, and because his mother is Queen Catherine of France, who's run off with a handsome Welsh squire of her household, whom she's alleged to have caught sight of bathing and rather fancied. And Lady Margaret Beaufort, who descends in a direct but female and somewhat flawed line from John of Gaunt. Again, John of Gaunt has this extraordinary story of 3 marriages, one for love, one for dynastic intention, and the other because it was the au pair. And the Tudors descend from the au pair. They descend from it's true, from Catherine Swynford. She is the au pair. And they were terribly happy together. It was a kind of rather like Charles and Camilla, except they produced lots of children. So Henry has got his only claim to a royal descent is through this third marriage of a third son. But his relations to his mother are profoundly close, and if you look at their letters, they're actually, which a lot survive, they have more the tone of actually lovers than just mother and son. And it's their intense relationship, and their intense religious relationship, as well as political one, but it's also the role of the confessor. And this is something we have completely forgotten. But we know it abroad. You know, if you think of an éminence grise, it is the supposed confessor to Cardinal Richelieu. If you think of the role of confessors in the Spanish court or the Habsburg court, we know they're powerful. They were equally powerful in the English court. And the way in which King's College finds itself completed is by the operation and cooperation of 2 confessors, the confessor to the king and the confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort. And the confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort is somebody of whom most of you, I think, will have heard, though perhaps not in the context of being a confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort. It's John Fisher, the Bishop of Rochester, the martyr and the founder, along with Lady Margaret, of St. John's College. And I want now to present a very different vision of Fisher from the usual sort of hardline saint, which indeed he was. Fisher at this stage, at the turn of the 16th century, about 1500, he is the star academic at Cambridge. He is the ultimate superdon of the period. He's staggeringly good looking, religiously ascetic, flamboyant, brilliant preacher, extraordinary personality, brilliant academically, superb administrator, the whole lot. And he is the one who is brought in 1501 when there's a great crisis in the university and the Vice-Chancellor is forced to, it's so modern, the Vice-Chancellor is forced to resign, there's a political coup, and Fisher becomes Vice-Chancellor on the same day that he gets his higher doctorate. You know, a doctorate of theology could hardly be anything more than that. And it's quite clear from that point onwards, Lady Margaret Beaufort has got her eye on him as her confessor. And she finally gets hold of him in 1504. Now, this in some ways is very extraordinary. He's an academic star. What does being a father confessor to Lady Margaret Beaufort mean? Well, it actually means, in one sense, you're an ecclesiastical body servant. You know, You're with a woman who is quasi, when actually behaves as royal, my lady the king's mother. She signs herself Margaret R, which may be Margaret Regina or maybe Margaret Richmond. She is the Dowager Countess of Richmond. And so what you have to do, of course, you kneel before her. If she says, go and buy a loaf of bread, you go and buy a loaf of bread, because you're a body servant as well. How did he put up with it? Because Lady Margaret Beaufort, she, the second person in the kingdom in reality, submits herself to him as her spiritual daughter, his spiritual daughter. She enacts a formal ritual in which she kneels, she offers up herself, body and soul, she takes him as her godly father and also her principal counsellor. So it's this bizarre relationship with, of course, all the power that comes from that relationship with the woman of second standing in the kingdom. And the first thing that Fisher does is to get Lady Margaret Beaufort intensely involved in Cambridge. We again have got all the dates of this wrong. We've got the date in which Lady Margaret Beaufort gets hold of Fisher. It's given us 10 years earlier than it really was. His academic career becomes unintelligible. It's as late as 1504. We've also completely ignored the fact that Lady Margaret Beaufort shows no interest in Cambridge at all until Fisher comes into her life. It's Fisher who attracts her to Cambridge. Before that, she had intended to commemorate herself in the way that we were talking about by a chantry, a collegiate foundation, along with her son in Westminster Abbey. And it's Fisher who persuades her to transfer that endowment to what? To a little runt of a college in Cambridge called God's House, which is reinvented as Christ's. Why does the transfer take place? Because the owner, the master that he actually is, he's called. He's not called master at this point. He's called proctor, which is very confusing. This is also a university office. A proctor is a man called Sickling, who was clearly, whilst you had Fisher as the academic star and the superdon and whatever, he's the one who does all the dirty work. He's the one who does all the squaring of faculty, writing off letters, raising money, and all the rest of it. And he is, I think, the person who points out to Fisher that God's House had nominally had, it's only nominally, Henry VI as its founder. So Lady Margaret Beaufort strips out the money from her Westminster endowment and gives most of it to founding a new college in Cambridge, to founding Christ. And the building of this college begins and gets really underway. And this is the point again at which you see Fisher assuming a more and more heavy role in the university, the role of Chancellor, again 1504. He's also given the Bishopric of Winchester, and the Bishopric of Rochester, the very bottom of the English scale of wealth of bishoprics. And how? Because, of course, as the confessor and counsellor to his mother, to Lady Margaret Beaufort, the king's mother, he, of course, is used as an intermediary between Lady Margaret and Henry VII. And when the negotiations have to go through to transfer the endowment from Westminster to this new college in King's, it is Fisher who goes up to court, goes up to Greenwich, and negotiates with Henry VII. And Henry VII is deeply impressed by him, writes back to his mother, I'm very impressed by your confessor. If you give me your consent, I will make him Bishop of Rochester, and so on. So we've now got Fisher moving firmly into both Lady Margaret Beaufort's circle and into the King's circle. He's a royal councillor, he's Chancellor of the University, he is Bishop of Rochester. He's also, because Margaret Beaufort didn't believe in doing things by halves, he's been made President of Queen's. Why has he been made President of Queen's? Because Queen's has got the only decent accommodation in Cambridge. Again, it's created under Richard III, when you get, for the first time, you get really serious royal interest in the university under Richard III. And the then President of Queen's, who's the real founder of the college, does something very extraordinary. If you remember the beautiful building of Queen's that runs by the mathematical bridge directly overlooking the river, whose prospect is now totally destroyed by the monstrous Fisher building on the other bank. Unspeakable, unspeakable combination. But that lovely late 15th century building is originally built as guest accommodation, and it is the only thing in Cambridge that replicates a royal suite. And that is why Fisher is made President of Queen's. It shows that the King and Lady Margaret can visit in style. This notion that it was to enable Fisher to stay in nice style whilst he's supervising the building of Christ is amiable nonsense. It's used by the King and it's used by Lady Margaret. So are we getting this? We're getting it coming nearer and nearer and nearer. But of course, the really key confessor is the King's confessor. Now, he is the absolute bullseye. Henry VII was having a terrible time with his confessors. He is famous to us, of course, as this ruthlessly miserly king, and I think the term is correct. But at the same time, he was fascinated with intense forms of religious observance, in particular the most, as it were, self-disciplining, literally self-flagellating of orders, the Franciscan observance. And there's this strange thing that the richer you were, the more you needed some sort of extreme observant or, poverty-stricken friar to pray for you. So it's a kind of obverse, it's sort of sorting out the Magnificat on earth. If you remember, he'll pull down the mighty from the seats and exalt them of low degree. Because although you were king and vastly rich, you were poor in heaven because you really hadn't done very well. Whereas he who flogs himself and is desperately poor is very rich in heaven. So you get you get the idea, a transfer effect. And Henry VII always had confessors who were friars observant. But the friars observant had renounced money. So here you have the king who is keenest on money in English history, who is also having a friar observant as his confessor. You can imagine the kind of tensions. We know about the tensions, and they lead to a rupture of the relationship, and the king has got to negotiate a new deal from the Pope, which authorizes him to appoint a new confessor. The Pope is a new Pope, Julius II, so as the cardinal in charge of English affairs in Rome, Adriano Castellesi, says, he's a new pope. He sort of, he respects the rules. He's a kind of Keith Starmer, and he later on proved to be a Keith Starmer indeed in terms of disobeying the rules, but that's another matter. So the Pope, when the king says, can we sort of fix this problem with my confessors, at first very, very reluctant. But then he sends his nephew, Guidobaldo, Duke of Urbino, along to explain that he really had a terrible favour that he wanted from Henry VII. He really desperately wanted his nephew, who, by the way, was a totally incompetent general and impotent and invariably lost battles. He wanted him to be made a Knight of the Garter. Castellesi is, of course, a genius and said, absolutely impossible. Just as impossible as it was that the Pope should, of course, give that, rather demanding bull that my king wants. Wink, wink. So a deal is done. The totally impossible fact of giving this Italian the knighthood of the Garter is rushed through. In the same time, the Pope rushes through the absolutely ungivable right to the king to appoint a fresh confessor. So it's how you handle relations with Rome. I think the Italians call it tangential. I think is the word. Anyway, so the deal is done, and a new confessor is appointed, who is indeed the provincial of the Fathers Observant, a man called Stephen Barron. See, he's French, but so we don't really, it's Stephanus Baronus, we just know his name in a Latin form. What does Fisher do? It's so modern. He offers him an honorary degree. He's immediately, the king's father confessor, is immediately whisked up to Cambridge and given an honorary degree. What do you do next? A series of distinguished lectures. So a series of distinguished lectures is invented for the king's father confessor. And of course, isn't it classic? All students are compelled to attend. There's absolutely no notion of a choice. You get again, nobody has spotted this. It's entirely new. We knew he gave lectures. Nobody's pinned it down. I was the first person to use, although they've been in print for a century and a half, the accounts of the proctors. And it actually actually shows the tolling of the bell for the lectures given by the king's confessor. It shows the fact they had to bring in all the seats, moving all the furniture around because it was held in the Grey Friars and so on. So you've got the king's confessor now being lined up on the side of Cambridge as well. Well, what is next? Fascinating. Henry, I think, is undergoing genuine religious crisis, because at this stage of his reign, having been one of the most extraordinary look at his life. Look at the fact that he has virtually no claim to the throne, that he's the child of a woman who's aged only 13, that his family is within whatever it is 3 years of his birth. The House of Lancaster falls. He's driven into exile after 1470. His first language is French. He's nearly captured by Richard III. He should have lost the Battle of Bosworth. His entire life is this series of extraordinary, as it were, acts of divine mercy, as he sees them. As indeed Fisher, in a great sermon that I'll quickly talk about, actually says to him, you have enjoyed the most extraordinary grace of God. But the grace of God turned against him, he thought, violently from 1502 onwards. He loses his first minister, Morton. He loses his eldest son, Prince Arthur. He loses his wife in the space of 2 years. This extraordinary reversal of fortune. And I think the whole crisis with the appointment of barons and whatever, as well as the business of, by the way, to get the torment of the character, at exactly the same time that he's appointing Stephen barons, he's also letting Empson and Dudley loose as financial agents. You get this extraordinary contradiction. I think it's all solved for Henry when suddenly God smiles on him again. And again, we're used to the Armada storm. There's another storm which arguably makes as much difference in European history, which is the great storm that drives the Philip of the Netherlands, the Archduke Philip the Fair, and Joanna, his wife, the sister of Catherine of Aragon, drives them ashore in January 1506. They'd been sailing to claim Castile in the right of Joanna after the death of Isabella of Castile. And they're driven ashore, which means effectively they're driven ashore at Falmouth, which means effectively that they are prisoners of Henry VII. And Henry had something that he very much wanted from the Archduke Philip, which is the Duke of Suffolk. Sorry, he's really the Earl of Suffolk. His proper title would have been Duke, but they've been stripped of the dukedom. Edmund de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, who descends directly from the Yorkist royal house. There have been all of these other pretenders like Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel. He is the real thing. And Henry is desperately worried about him, and chance and the hand of God delivers Suffolk into his hands. Suffolk is handed over with one of the sort of royal thuggees supervising the process of the cross-channel journey and all the rest of it, and is safely popped into the Tower, and the promise of safe conduct and everything else which had been given to Philip is conveniently forgotten. So the king has got the man that he most wants. He's got the royal alternative in his hands. What does he do? He goes on pilgrimage to Walsingham. Where does he stop? He stops in Cambridge. And in Cambridge, Fisher takes over. And you have this extraordinary scene. It's Easter. You enact, it's St. George's Day. My point is they stay there for Easter as well. But it's the 23rd of April, and the entire ceremonies of the Orders of the Garter are enacted in the sort of incomplete structure of the chapel at King's. The man who officiates both at the Mass and as prelate of the order is who? John Fisher. And what does Henry VII do? He begins a re-engagement with kings. And I think we can just see, how the process is done. So you begin, and of course Henry VII, being Henry VII, you begin by drawing up indentures, contracts, there's a sum handed over, you have a site meeting and all the rest of it. 100 quid, quite a lot. And then it goes cold. So obviously it's gone quite some far, but there's still debate. What happens next? What happens next, ladies and gentlemen, simply is a miracle. We've got to understand it is a miracle. And the miracle occurs the following year, in 1507. The king has the first, we're not sure, it may be throat cancer. Some of you can tell me if I describe the symptoms more fully. It may be throat cancer or something of the sort, but anyway, they call it a quinsy, and he finds it impossible to eat. His life is despaired of. He makes a will, and so on. And then suddenly he recovers. Now, I don't know the inside story. Obviously, Stephen Barron did, and I'm sure John Fisher did. But what does the king do to give thanks? He doesn't go to the Virgin at Walsingham. He goes to Windsor, where, of course, Henry VI is buried. And he begins making some amends and making a significant contribution to the building of the finishing of the roof of the Garter Chapel, which, by the way, is not undertaken by a king. It's undertaken by Reginald Bray, Henry VII's principal minister at that point, and you can actually see Bray's hemp press in the vaulting. And then this is what happens next. He decides, and I think it can only be because he'd gone to Windsor. Why does he go to Windsor? Because he must have prayed to Henry VI as a saint. Remember, he's as it were, an unofficial saint. He's sainted by popular reputation. The shrine again, we must understand this. The shrine is more visited at this point than that of Thomas Becket. He is the popular miracle worker. So I am convinced that the reason that he goes, it has to be, the reason that he goes immediately to Windsor, and we have 3 days of offerings to Henry's shrine, to Our Lady of Eton, and all the rest of it. But most important of all, he then goes on a specific visit to Cambridge, and he deliberately goes for the commencement. That's the equivalent of the degree day. And who delivers the speech? Fisher. And Fisher delivers this extraordinary sermon cum speech, which is the basis of our real entire original biographical knowledge of Henry. It's the sermon which describes the fact that his mother's only 13, this extraordinary picaresque career of disasters, narrow squeaks, with God always intervening. And clearly, at the end, you get the pattern coming down. And not only did you save England, you've saved Cambridge. And how has Cambridge been saved? Cambridge has been saved because of kings who benefited. And he goes back to the supposed King Canterbury, the king of the East Angles, who had allegedly studied in Athens under the Anglo-Saxons, decided, complete fiction of course, decided to found the University of Cambridge, to Henry III, who'd built the Grey Friars, to Edward III, who'd built King's Hall, not to be confused with King's College, to Henry VI, and finally, the king who will complete the legacy of Henry VI, a work that is called of a king because it is built by a king, it is worthy of a king, and only a king can finish it. And you, sir, absolutely magnificent. That's how Kings comes to be finished. And we've got to understand the scale of what Henry does. It's £10,000 in cash, 1/10 of royal income. The scale of Henry's benefactions at this point are as extraordinary as almost the scale of his bribes to the Habsburgs. Because this bizarre quality of Henry VII, on the one hand, this religiosity, this passionate desire for endorsement by the observant order, and on the other hand, this utter graspingness, because the works of Empson and Dudley are on a scale even more extraordinary than Henry's generosity to kings. In 1 year, just to put this in perspective, and I'll leave the thing hanging on this note of ambiguity. £10,000 finishes the building of King's College Chapel in 6 years. Can you imagine the speed at which it's done? At the same time, he's building the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster. I mean, the number of skilled masons that you have available, and you're starting building John's. Utterly extraordinary. £10,000 to do that. In 1 year, he gives a bribe to the Habsburgs of £132,000 in cash. That's when royal income is 100,000. The extraordinary complexities of the man. But the heart of it, this bad king who turned into a good saint, miracle-working saint, and that convenient miracle that rescues Henry VII from a Quincy is why we have Kings finished. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for, as expected, a brilliant talk without notes, just completely off the cuff. We have got time for 1 or 2 questions, so if anyone wants to...
Or indeed, recriminations. Not treating these sacred buildings with the appropriate... So,
Could I ask a question? I think it must have been in the 90s. I was asked to a big do at New College, which commemorated the link between Eton, King's, Winchester and New.
Yeah.
And I think it was called the Amicitiae Concordia or something like that.
yes, I mean, the point is, as I said, virtually everybody who is involved in the foundation of Eton had begun at Winchester. I mean, Winchester is the model, because Winchester's a century earlier. William of Wykeham is under Edward III. He is the King's Master of Building Works. He's also a war profiteer, and disgracefully he's made Bishop of Winchester. It's the equivalent of Prince Charles appointing one of his favourite architects. It's that sort of thing. But he founds Winchester, and he founds New College in exactly the same relationship as King's and Eton, and the statutes again are handed over. Again, the man I was talking about, William Waynflete, who saves Eton, clearly is profoundly committed to it. He had begun at Winchester, and he actually takes boys from Winchester as when he's the first provost of Eton. He may even have been the first headmaster of Eton, but very briefly. But then he's provost of Eton, and he takes a posse of boys from Winchester to get the school going. So you have this deeply intimate relationship.
Is there a document, which is this, which...
That I do not know. I'm sorry. I'm a great believer in saying I don't know when I don't know. And I'm sorry, I can't answer that. But essentially, you see, again, this process continues. We've forgotten it because one half of it's gone. When Wolsey, because Wolsey, of course, is the real founder of Christ Church, which was to be known as Cardinal College, when he founds that, he also founds a grammar school, a college school in Ipswich, which is intended to have exactly the same function. And Thomas More tries to save both. And he finds that the only one he can actually save is Oxford. And Henry gets it, and the courtiers get their hands on, particularly the Duke of Suffolk. Not of that. Obviously, this is Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, gets his hands on the Winchers, on the Ipswich stuff. So that's the story.
And of course, our chap Harmon there was another Ipswich man.
Yes, I didn't know that.
I'm almost sure that's right.
Right.
And Butts also in that picture.
I don't know Butts' education. I mean, Butts again is a Cambridge man, where Butts seems to fit into the story. I mean, I have lectured on that here before, and we might, because I've found out much more about all of this. Butts fits into the story primarily because he is the person in 1528 who is held to save Anne Boleyn. And he is also, he's master of Gonville, which becomes Gonville and Keys, and he then acts really, it's very Cambridge spies, he acts as sort of recruiter at Cambridge for Protestantism, you know. And it's a role that is, you know, going to continue rather odoriferously in the university thereafter. But again, this picture here, we've never properly understood what the inscription is about. I've now really worked it out. Some of you may have heard the joint anniversary lecture I gave for the Royal College and the Society and the Apothecaries. I don't know whether you did. But if you look at the inscription there, what the inscription is basically saying is Henry VIII is the patron of medicine who reinvented medicine because of his patronage of Lineker and the rediscovery of the accurate texts of Galenic medicine. So he's reformed medicine by the discovery of the proper Greek text, because Lineker devotes most of his life to very elaborate editions of Galen. And what it then says is, in the same way that he has reformed medicine, he has also reformed the church by going back to scripture. That's what that inscription is about, and I don't think it's been properly understood. That's essentially what it's about. And I think it's probably the reason why in fact, I would suspect that notion there of the king, as it were, the king is showing himself there as a kind of doctor of his kingdom in both senses of the word. The sense of teacher, doctor's teacher, but also doctor as reformer, purger. And again, you know, very often, because again, you know, they took the idea of body politic very seriously. So you get the notion of rulership as being very closely related to medicine. But so that's where Butts fits in, and of course he's there, as you all know. And next to him, of course, is Chamber, who is the absolute opposite in terms of religion. And Henry's doctors, you have one Catholic and one Prod. It's a bit like Northern Ireland, you know. Yes, and and Chamber is the complete opposite. Butts, again, is the first doctor to be knighted. He is the first layman doctor. Whereas Chamber is the last of the great high clerical doctors. He is master of St. Stephen's, the St. Stephen's Chapel that becomes the House of Commons after secularisation. Oh, by the way, do you all now see why Oxford and Cambridge nearly are dissolved in the 1540s, and why you need Catherine Parr to save them? Because they're all religious foundations devoted to seeing souls through purgatory, which Henry VIII has abolished. Sort of, except he leaves provisions for purgatory in his will. I mean, Henry, again, it's very much having his, I suppose not cake, his wafer and eating it. It's waferism rather than cakeism, I think, is it.
Any other questions before we adjourn for supper?
Reduce you to silence, that's shameful, yes.
Well, there will be an opportunity to chat over a glass of wine and a sandwich and a sausage roll or whatever they have next door. So that leaves me to thank David Starkey for such a wonderful lecture, and to welcome him back to the hall after rather too long. I think.
As I said, I'm a very bad barber. I'm very sorry.
There's no such thing as a bad barber. You're either a barber or you aren't. So, so perhaps we'll give him a round of applause. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.